Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Today's guest works for the Atlas Society, and he is the co-host of the podcast, the Ayn Rand Fan Club. Scott Schiff, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I am here in an individual capacity.
Yes, he's not representing the Atlas Society. So if he screws up, don't take it as their screw up. I'm here in my own capacity also, representing myself. Okay. So I wanted to have you on here today to talk about schisms within the liberty movement. You've been involved in the liberty movement for what, about 30 years?
At least, yeah.
Yeah. So tell me if I'm missing any. So within objectivism, which is an aspect of the liberty movement, you have closed objectivist versus open objectivist, and you also have some closed objectivist versus other closed objectivists. We have the objectivists versus the libertarians. Within the libertarian movement, you have the minarchists versus the anarchists, and I'm sure I'm missing some, right? I mean, but there's a lot, right? There's a lot of different sort of things, and these things get vitriolic, right? Like, it's not just we slightly disagree. It gets to the point where, like, you're a no good SOB because we disagree.
Right. It's couched as a moral failing. You're dishonest. You're not a real one of us.
Yeah. See, to me, I mean, I'd consider myself a disciple of Ayn Rand. I don't call myself an objectivist simply because there's a few areas where I would disagree with her, and I don't care to argue with people who then would say, you're no objectivist, whatever, call me whatever you want. But to me, I've always thought of objectivists as within the libertarian umbrella, because I look at libertarianism as more of a political viewpoint that says that the purpose of the use of force is to protect the lives, the liberty, and property of the citizenry, and is pro-capitalism. I don't really think of it going beyond that, although there are people within libertarianism, like I said, anarchists and minarchists, but it's a pretty large umbrella term. But there's objectivists, right, who would like want to just about fight if they believed in the initiation of force, because I've said that, right?
Well, you have to understand, I mean, Peter Schwartz, while Rand was still alive, wrote this thing on libertarianism being a perversion of liberty. And she said she endorsed it. And then, ultimately, one of the first excuses for kicking Kelly out of ARI was that he went and talked to libertarians, which it was Schwartz that went on the attack against him. So, that is a thing that's been in the movement. And then I've seen a phenomenon of you see, it's like Rand talked about in the Romantic Manifesto, an artist can kind of pick out what they want to represent based on their sense of life. So you see this pattern of objectivists always looking for things that libertarians are doing wrong. And really just, that's what they draw their picture of. Almost as a type of loyalty that doesn't that just a lot of people have said it has hurt the growth of the liberty movement over the past generation.
I thought that Schwartz wrote that in 87. Maybe, I guess I'm wrong. I want
to say it was 89. Well, you're talking about on sanctioning the sanctioners.
Yes.
I want to say that was 88 or 89, but it's minor.
But she died in 82. That's why I'm saying.
Right, but he wrote something about libertarianism being a perversion of liberty and the intellectual.
I'm sorry, that's what I'm talking about. I thought that was at about 87. I must be wrong. I mean, I was in prison.
I remember something of her endorsing it because I came into Ayn Rand through kind of libertarianism. And just seeing that, I was just like, oh, come on, man. We're supposed to hate these guys. They almost believe the same thing.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because like I've read that as well. And it seemed to me like they focused in on a very narrow version of libertarianism with Rothbardianism, ultimately the sort of anarchist wing. But that's not all libertarianism is. See, the whole reason this concerns me is because there's so few of us that think that the initiation of force should be banned from human relationships that we can't afford to then nitpick each other. And I'm not saying we shouldn't discuss differences, debate differences. Look, you and I on your podcast have debated differences. That's fine. But it seems to me like if there's a candidate out there that's representing our viewpoint or close to it, we ought to support him, even if he didn't get there philosophically the same way that we did, because I don't see us ever gaining enough traction to elect a candidate if we don't put aside slight differences.
Well, that's true, but one of the rationales they use, and we had you on for this episode about confusion in the movement, and they say, well, it's actually worse if you're close to us but not exact, because then you're going to give this false impression of what capitalism is, and then when it doesn't work, people are going to blame capitalism. And the socialists are blaming capitalism anyway
for everything. Well, if you're running for office, right, Scott Schiff for president, that's not an endorsement, but if Scott Schiff's running for president, right, so I want to vote for you, can I just say largely agree with him, but there's things with which I disagree? It's like you came on the show, you work for the Atlas Society, right? Now, presumably you don't share every view with every other member of the Atlas Society. So you came on and you say to avoid—
It's impossible. They don't all share the same views.
Yeah. So to avoid confusion, you say, I'm not representing the Atlas Society. And that does it right there. And why can't we do that? So if I'm the spokesperson for the Libertarian Party of Connecticut. A lot of libertarians are against intellectual property. It's not in the platform, but still, it's pretty known that a lot are against it. I'm not. So if I were to support a candidate, I would just say I disagree with them about intellectual property. What is so difficult about that?
Yeah, I think that is part of what happens. You have to assess the candidate on the whole, where you can be against tariffs, but you end up having to support someone for tariffs because they end up, being so much better on the other issues, or the other candidate is so much worse on the other issues in terms of restricting freedoms that you can't just get caught up in one single issue. People do. And they have a right to it as part of their hierarchy of values, but I could argue it's not in their long-term interest.
No, I'm a big opponent of the war on drugs. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it's a violation of individual rights, and I think the consequences are awful. But if there was a candidate, or if there were a candidate running in Connecticut where I live, or running for president, and he said, look, I'm against antitrust laws. I'm against the minimum wage. I want to get rid of it. I want to deregulate the economy. I want to get rid of, all tariffs. I want to get us out of foreign wars. But I'm not getting rid of the war on drugs. I would say, okay, I'll go for it. This guy shares most of my views. Let me vote for him, because if the other guy gets in, the war on drugs isn't going anywhere either. But this guy agrees with most of me. So why not support him? Just state that I disagree with him on that and move on. But it just seems like within this movement, and granted, this happens with a lot of movements. I mean, it's not just the liberty movement where you end up with fractions. I read an article last night about schisms, and they talked about Frederick Douglass versus William Lloyd Garrison and John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. So it's a common
you read
thing.
the ARI piece?
I did read the ARI piece. Yes, I did. I like to brush up on things before I come on the air. So yes, I did. And the funny thing is, Scott, I found myself in principle a lot of the way agreeing with it. It's the application where I think it can get kind of ridiculous. I mean,
we did a show taking down that particular essay and some of the premises that they I won't get into it here, but go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, go ahead. That's why I have you here. I want to hear you talk about it.
So they seem to take these kind of different attitudes of whether or not they act as arbiters for who is or who isn't a real objectivist, and it kind of goes back and forth depending on what's needed at that particular moment. It just it seems somewhat it can be arbitrary, and that goes back to the sanction issue. When who you're not allowed to talk to, or you need to be removed from the movement. That kind of and I will say I want to go back to what you said about it happening in other parts of the movement. I do think there's something to be said about individualists, and maybe there's something in that that causes people to fight. But I will say that objectivism in particular has this view that there need not be conflicts between rational people. So in that sense, I do hold, fans of Ayn Rand and the kind of expanding pie theory generally to a little bit higher standard.
Well, I think that that's fair. The conflict of interest you're referring to, it's an essay by Rand in the Virtue of Selfishness, right? There's no conflict of interest amongst rational men is the idea, right? But it has to do with
Right.
a
I
conflict of
think that
interest. It
was kind
doesn't,
of been
yeah,
implied in Galt's Gulch as
yeah, but it
well.
doesn't mean that there's no intellectual disagreements. I mean, even in Atlas Shrugged, Hugh Axton, if that's how you pronounce it, but he disagreed with his student Ragnar Danijol's method of fighting the fight that they were taking on. He didn't like the idea that he was a pirate. So there was disagreement there, and it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like they stopped talking or they hated each other or anything like that. They was just disagreed.
But in that essay of Schisms, they're basically trying to rationalize anytime you have disagreements with the management, you should just kind of go your own way. And
No, well,
so,
that's what I mean about the application. That's where I disagree. I agree that I ought not to sanction evil, that I ought not to associate myself with a evil group or with that part of a group that I disagree with, that I should state it clearly, this is where I stand. I think that that's true. But if I literally, because I used to say this when I was in prison and guys would say to me, oh, how can you talk to that guy? That guy is a real scumbag or whatever. And I would say to him, listen, if I didn't talk to anybody in here that didn't uphold my morality, I would never speak to another soul. And I mean, that just flies in the face of egoism. I couldn't function as a human being if I really implemented that, where nobody alive is going to get my conversation if they disagree with me morally or intellectually. And Rand, and I'm pretty sure Peikoff said that because most people are of a mixed character, that it's the sort of obligation of a moral person to decipher which aspects of that person is moral, which are immoral, and deal only with the moral parts. But somehow that seems to have gone away. And you're from the objectivist side of things, so obviously, we'll probably focus more on that. But like Ludwig von Mises, he stopped talking to Fritz. I think it's Matchlip. I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name, but he stopped talking to him for 3 years over a disagreement about the gold standard. I mean, this is, he stormed out of a meeting of the Mount Pelerin Society and called them all a bunch of socialists. And then, of course, Murray Rothbard, always was attacking Milton Friedman. Mark Skousen told the story that when he took over at the Foundation for Economic Education, one person came to him and said, listen, since you're taking over, I need you to do something. Stop going so hard on Milton Friedman, so stop the company from going hard on Milton Friedman. Then somebody else told him, listen, the one thing you've got to do is you've got to go tougher on Milton Friedman. We just haven't been tough enough. You know what I mean? Now, look, I disagree with Friedman about a lot myself, but to say that he wasn't defending capitalism to me is just absurd.
Some of this gets back to just group dynamics and turf wars. And then, nobody wants to admit that. So they couch it in intellectual and moral terms. That's the real
Well,
truth.
sometimes it's just they don't like somebody, and then they come up with a rationalization, right? Well, I don't like the
Right.
person, so the person's evil.
But even that not liking is still, it's because hey, they think they can come in here and act like they know everything and take control.
Do you think that there's part of this the schism thing? Another guy said he's appalled with the Libertarian Party. I saw this online because they didn't put in their platform to go against intellectual property. So he was done with them over that issue. But I think that a lot of this with people, with smart people, brilliant people like a von Mises or Ayn Rand or even a Sigmund Freud. I mean, Sigmund Freud ended up with all these schisms with his students where he ended up calling them Oedipus ingrates. Part of this is that when you're that smart and you work that hard to come up with a theory, any sort of disagreement with it, I can understand would be taken sort of as a real blow. But I think what happens, or maybe what happens, is that the people that follow these movements, myself included, as a follower of Ayn Rand, they end up taking on the characteristics of the people that led the movement to begin with. In your experience, is there any
That's
truth to that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I'm probably opening up a big can of worms here, but
Open it up. It'll be controversy. Might get me ratings.
I grew up Jewish, and I only learned in the past couple of years that being a grudge holder is a Jewish stereotype. I just thought it was my family.
It's funny because my grandfather was Jewish, and I remember when I was a kid, we went into the store. My father brought me into a store, and there was a guy, and my father says, "Yeah, Grandpa and that guy used to be friends, but now they haven't talked for 30 years." So maybe there's something to that. I don't know. At least we're both, have Jewish ancestry, so no one can accuse us of being anti-Semitic.
That's right. No, but I mean, the truth is, I am a big grudge holder. And there are things that, I was like, all right, that's it. It's like, and over time, I think I have mellowed a little bit and been like, it turns out that person that crossed me on that one issue wasn't evil all these years after all, if I'm really doing an objective assessment. And maybe it wasn't worth, going to the wall over IP or whatever the issue was.
Well, one of the reasons I liked talking with you, and I, debated with you on your show, and we've gone back and forth on social media, is because you don't do that. You don't, get all uptight because I disagree with you. We can disagree vehemently, but still be, friendly. I don't hate you because you've come to a different conclusion. Now, if I thought you were just being dishonest, that would be different. But I think that, like you said earlier, there is this jump to think that if somebody disagrees with what I'm saying, they're either a fool or a knave. It can't be honest disagreement. It's like I'm the smartest person in the room, and therefore, if someone's disagreeing with me, something's wrong, right? There seems to be that tendency.
Yeah, and that is also among intellectuals, and that comes up in Rand because I mean sometimes they say, well, there's no way that an honest person could not see that. And that becomes, I mean, and I think that's part of my attitude. I've seen so many of these tactics over time. I mean, it was an objectivist that first called me evil and immoral 30 years ago.
Really?
So it just, hearing all, so now when they do that, I'm just like, oh, that's so cute. He's calling me dishonest. Um, it's one of their things as they're getting ready to block you.
I mentioned on an Ayn Rand chat room, in an Ayn Rand chat room, that I disagreed with her definition of value, not her theory of value, but just the definition.
Right.
And,
I
and
think
a
I saw
guy,
that.
yeah, and a guy actually responded to me, and he says, "Why would you?" He said, "You're not an objectivist. Why would you even bring that up? You're risking being censured." And I'm just like, being censured. Listen, I'm 46 years old. I'm not concerned. What is censure me? Really? Because I put out my viewpoint? Go ahead. I take Rand's view seriously. I'm an individualist. So if the collective wants to censure me, I'm okay with that. I'll survive. I've survived a long time without, that particular group. But I will say this, guy. I've had conversations, and I had him on the show with James Valiant, who's a closed objectivist, and I never got that out of him. He's been very receptive to me, and we've had discussions where I've disagreed with him, and he's been fine. So I don't want to sort of paint with too broad a brush. I heard I saw you posted about Craig Biddle, and you said, he as a closed objectivist isn't what you normally would have thought. So I think we do run sort of that danger of being schism causers ourselves if we accuse everybody else of being schism causers, because then now we're just, in the food fight, right?
I get that, but one of the ways we're a little different. I'm more of a counterpuncher. Maybe that's part of the way my grudges express themselves. So I have to keep it inside for 30 years. Um, but I do think that it's when you see. I mean, when you're with the Atlas Society, it's like you get these orthodox people calling you fraud and saying they're not allowed to associate with you. I mean, it does start to rub on you and get you a little upset after a while.
Sure.
And so, to see that, I mean, James, you brought him up. He was on our show. I mean, I think he's, a little Ahabian about when it comes to Brandon and his problems. I have my own issues with Brandon, but I just don't think that he's the most evil person in the world. And, I saw him kind of convert Mark Pellegrino over the air, who also did sessions with Brandon in the 90s like I did, to kind of turn on him and hate Brandon. And I just, I just don't, that seems to have like undertones of just, there's one right way to think about things. I know you're a bit of a Brandon fan too.
Hold on.
This is you at some point.
Yeah, you're gonna get me with all kinds of hate mail here. I'm a fan of a lot of Brandon's work, and just like I'm a fan of a lot of Rand's work. And the thing is, I didn't know them. I didn't know either one of them personally. That what had took place between them happened 8 years before I was born. I really don't care. I have read The Psychology of Self-Esteem. I love it. Now, there's things that I come to find out that Brandon was very hypocritical writing it. I don't care. I find the ideas worthwhile. If he didn't live up to them, that's his issue. That's not my issue. And it's the same thing with Ayn Rand. People criticize her. They want to attack her personally rather than going after her ideas. I don't care. I didn't know her. You know what I mean? I'm in no position. And that's another area where I agreed with the piece I read last night, because they talked about when you're dealing with private things, you don't have enough information to go on. So it's difficult to judge those things. Being like I said, that there's so many different interpretations of what took place back then. There's no way for me to assess it. Maybe if I wanted to devote my life to figuring out what happened with the Nathaniel Branden Institute, I could come to a conclusion, but that to me is a waste of time. You know what I mean? Ultimately, it doesn't affect my life.
There's a kind of forbidden books attitude of don't read Brandon, don't read Kelly. I mean, even their intellectual stuff, sometimes they'll say that's not the case, but I'll give you one example. The most prominent psychologist on the objectivist side, she was asked about Brandon. She said she hadn't read him. I just find that odd. And, it's just like the number of people that happen to be huge Rachmaninoff fans that are Rand fans. It's like, I mean, the personal musical tastes don't have to shape your identity. It's part of the philosophy of being loyal to it.
No, that's true. But, in defense of whoever this woman is, and I don't know who she is, this psychologist, I'm a big fan of psychology. I've got an associate's in psychology. I haven't read every psychologist either. So I don't know the context. Was she saying, no, I would never read that man, or just, no, I haven't read him?
I mean, no one ever says I'm not reading him out of loyalty to the tribe. But, she just said she hadn't read him yet. And maybe it's not that, but it just seems... Look, I have a friend 30 years ago that was basically told not to, read anything by Kelly or Brandon, and she felt guilty about it. See, they have to, now it's much more subtle.
I'm finding this a little, to me, a little entertaining, because because I can sense that while I wanted to talk about schisms, and granted, look, I was in prison. You know what I mean? I discovered all this stuff in prison. So I've read about this stuff, but I was never enmeshed in it until I came out and started posting things. And then I've got various people, don't talk to this one. You shouldn't associate with that guy. And I'm like, oh my Lord. But you seem to be just right in the mix of the insider baseball. Like you're a part of the schisms. Because you're taking while you're saying, yes, they're doing this, they're blackballing us, but I can clearly see it irritates you. And I don't know, I'm not saying you're wrong, because I ultimately don't know how to if I'm trying to start a movement to build liberty, for instance, and then all of a sudden, so I say, okay, let's get all these groups together, and someone starts attacking me, I would feel the need to defend myself and to fight back, and probably wouldn't like that person very much. But at the same time, I recognize then I would be now involved in the schism. And I don't know how that's avoidable. Is it avoidable?
Yeah, I mean, you can draw parallels to the wider cultural war as well.
Sure.
Because, I mean, do you get involved, or, or do you want to stay out of the fight? Can you stay out of the fight?
Well, the thing is this: if you take us, you and me, and you say, okay, here's these Black Lives Matter critical race theorists, and you should collaborate on areas where you disagree, that would be impossible. I mean, we would so fundamentally disagree with their view of history, their view of economics, their view of how people should live their lives. There'd be no room for collaboration. But I suspect if you were to take a closed objectivist, an open objectivist, and a minarchist libertarian, the anarchists maybe are too far off the cliff. But even them, I would say, would agree with these statements. Look, should we have free markets? Should we have should the only use of force be used in self-defense or retaliatory force? Should minimum wage go? Should markets be deregulated? The sort of all these issues, I think we would all agree on. So we, like, for instance, the libertarians in the Rothbardian vein, they put self-ownership as their primary from which they deduce their theory. Whereas Randians or, objectivists say, no, it's the right to life that precedes everything else. But the conclusions end up the same. So if you want to argue about what the sort of root is, I get it. But in the end, if they're supporting the same policies, we should be able to work together, I would think. But I mean, I'm wrong because we don't. But like I said, like in the broader cultural, it's so different that it just seems like a different dynamic to me.
I agree. I mean, your issue is more with closed objectivism that specializes in telling people that you can't work with other groups, that's part of, what it's sometimes they'll say it's not part of it, but there's always, you ask your own who he wants to work with, and he's like, what would we work on together? He literally said that. So, it's just, you can pay lip service to working with others, but there's a mentality. And that was one of Kelly's charges, that closed objectivism leads to insularity with an inability. And it's not, some of it's just part of that tribal scaredness, because once you see Kelly get kicked out of that, you want to go lead the charge on opening the door with libertarians? No, you're going to get, if you work at ARI, that's a sure way to get fired.
All right, Scott, you done dragged me into this now because you keep mentioning closed objectivism. So let me state, this is my view of the subject of closed. I personally think objectivism is a closed system. I think it's closed because it has one creator, Ayn Rand. She's dead. Similarly, an Aristotelian, for instance, right? You wouldn't, if somebody strayed from Aristotle, you wouldn't call him an Aristotelian. What they would be called is a neo-Aristotelian. Similar with Platonists. There's a philosophy that Plato put out, and when people start to diverge from it, even if they take the roots, they call themselves Neoplatonists. They don't call themselves open Platonists or open Aristotelians. So from that perspective, I can understand saying, no, if you're disagreeing with Ayn Rand, you're not an objectivist in the Ayn Rand sense, because she was an objectivist. I would get that. What I don't get is this other stuff that you're talking about, which I haven't been involved in enough to know how widespread it is the sort of excommunicating everybody who strays or who differs from Rand and not being able to work with them.
Well, you mentioned people were advising you on who not to talk to.
Sure. But I don't know I don't know. It wasn't like I got a memo from the Ayn Rand Institute. I don't know who these people are. They're just on Facebook.
It's more subtle than that. It's just, and this happens in other social groups as well. They don't tell you to, hate anyone for capitalism, but the message kind of gets through.
Well, when it comes to open objectivism, I just want to ask this question.
Yeah.
Why claim that it's objectivism? Like, why not say we're like you do in your show, we're fans of Ayn Rand, we believe in a lot of her ideas, but we differ on some, so therefore we're not objectivist. Why does it have to stay?
Knowledge is hierarchical.
It is,
first of
sure.
all, they don't even specify which of Rand's attitudes are fundamental and which aren't. Do you have to believe that, a female shouldn't be president to, because that was one of her views that
But
she
that was
tied to a
clearly
metaphysical
derivative.
view
But
of
that's clearly
masculinity and
derivative.
femininity.
Yeah,
What's
that's
that?
not primary. That's like not in her
Right.
philosophical
And so
system.
David Kelly put together a list of what he thinks is primary.
Okay.
And what I find is that most people don't think they're allowed to read that list out of some sort of loyalty. And if they read that list, they're down a path that can get them excommunicated from their friends and support network.
Okay. So that's why you still call it objectivism, because what you're saying is, and this is veering from where I wanted to go, but it's okay. It's all right. So you're saying that
Your show.
You still call it objectivism because in terms of fundamentals, you would agree. So you would agree.
He puts out like 17 fundamentals.
Well, so I haven't read the list, but let me share what I think are some of the fundamentals, right? The axiomatic, the axiomatic concepts, fundamental, right? Axiomatic existence, identity,
that's in there,
right? Epistemology, reason is the means to knowledge. The supremacy of existence, the hierarchical nature of knowledge, the concepts, the correspondence theory. Basically, it's her version of the correspondence.
It's interesting.
Theory.
He doesn't put the theory of concepts in there as one of the fundamentals, but even though he says he agrees generally with it.
Okay, so in ethics, you would have to say yes. Value, life is the standard of value. Human life is the standard of moral value. Obviously couldn't disagree with that. The primary virtue of rationality, the six derivative virtues, all those are primaries, right? I mean, you would have to, they're not all primaries. They're fundamental in the sense.
I would want to refer you to the list specifically. I don't have the.
I know, but I want to know what you think. I'm trying to get to the. I'm trying to get to this.
All that what you're saying is relatively fair starting points. Yeah, and that was my point in the open closed debate episode we did. If somebody accepts all of that and you're still nitpicking them and saying you're not a real objectivist, then you're just looking for ways to be moralizing and to exclude people from your group.
Okay. See, I agree with all of that. Now. And I also agree that the purpose of government is to protect individual rights. So I'm a firm believer in capitalism. Where I disagree is this. I've seen it said that people that believe, unless they take that view, then they're not capitalists. They're not supporting capitalists. I've actually seen people say this. Unless you're taking the Randian view, the Randian route, I should say, of arriving to your support for capitalism, you're not a supporter of capitalism. So therefore, libertarians are not supporters of capitalism. By that logic, Adam Smith, John Baptiste Say, Frederick Bastiat, Ludwig von Mises, none of them are supporters of capitalism. That's palpably absurd. And Rand, by the way, wouldn't have said that because she recommended Mises's works. She said, look, these guys aren't objectivists, but nonetheless, the work is worth reading. And she was also friends with them, although it was a rocky relationship. So that's where I would disagree. And that's why I said earlier that I agree in principle with the essay I read yesterday. What I disagree is when the application gets to the point where everybody who disagrees with me is a no good, dirty jerk. And I'm not even saying that the guys who wrote that essay, that's what they do. I don't know those guys. I'm just saying that that's the impression that I'm getting. That's what I'm hearing is happening. And if that is what's happening, that's where I would disagree. And I certainly would disagree when it comes to working with libertarians, at least of the non-anarchical branch. I'm not saying I personally wouldn't work with the anarchists. I'm just saying I can understand that might be a bridge too far for some objectivists to go.
Sure. That's where I disagree. And even with the Atlas Society to some extent, I think, the NCAPs have the energy in the movement, and you don't have to agree with them to be able to say, let's try to, we're all for less regulation.
Yeah, we can move away from regulation, and then once we get to the point where we want to stop, argue then, right?
That's right.
And argue with it. Yeah, I agree with that. I
And
just,
I don't need to convert a Christian and tell him that he has to accept my metaphysics and epistemology. If he accepts the initiation of force principle,
you almost slipped. Scott Schiff, you almost slipped and said the non-aggression principle. You almost said it. I caught you. So it's a good thing you're not here speaking for the Atlas Society.
that's right.
Because I don't know if you'd be in trouble with them, but with a lot of people, you definitely would be.
That's funny. I mean, as a generalized principle, you can say, yes, it's not really objectivist and it's, but I mean, look, it's just a way of saying, hey, we're against initiation of force.
Sure. And if it's in politics, in order to have a political movement, you have to go broader than just what you think. There's no way around it. Now, we might disagree. Look, you voted for Trump, I think, based on what you've said to me. I've got friends that voted for Trump. I wouldn't have. But when someone
I'm never woke.
Well, but when someone says to me, I don't support everything Trump does, but I feel it's my civic duty to vote, and therefore I had to pick the lesser of two evils. I personally wouldn't do that, but I understand that it's a tough choice. I understand that the person could just as easily say to me, so you're just staying out of it and you're staying out of the fight. And I don't want somebody to ostracize me based on my choice in that matter. So I'm not going to ostracize them based on their choice in that matter either. But there's so much more in common with libertarians and classical liberals and other objectivists that it seems like we should just be able to get together and do something. For God's sake, this country's falling apart. I mean, we're so anti-capitalist right now that people think that if we would just stop the growth of Social Security and Medicare, we'd be a capitalist country. You know what I mean? They think that that's a part of capitalism, for God's sake. Those are the people, it seems to me, that we should be combating, not this. And again, not debate. I'm saying debate. Debate's great. I love it. But this vitriolic hatred for one another based on these slight disagreements seems very counterproductive to me.
It's honestly, there's some evasion going on. I think you bring up a great point about realizing the context that we're in. And, it's because I see this just unceasing centralization happening globally, that even among businesses and government, that you have to take that into account. With objectivists, I think, just thought Rand's ideas were just going to march through the culture and they weren't going to have to take any effort on it, and that's why they could afford to be just as flippant and casting out anyone that disagreed just the least bit. But at a certain point, it becomes a way of almost hiding from the culture war. It's like, no, I don't. I'm agnostic in all this.
Well, I tell you what, I'm definitely not agnostic in the culture war. I just wouldn't take I don't want to belong to Trump's culture either. The culture that he wants is not the culture I want.
Yeah, I mean, it just, I want there to be a check on this system. I see it in more historical terms. I see woke as a new religion. We're at like the crisis of the 3rd century in Rome, but the Christians are actually, of today, are actually the old pagans that are on the way out. And so, I just, a lot of people are just trying to ignore what's going on. And I think it's the main thing, that it's where the liberty movement can come in and be a different voice if they will do that, and just be willing to stand up against it. Because standing up against woke means taking, the slings and arrows. It's like being a Kelly fan.
All right, Scott, we're just about out of time. But before we go, did I leave anything out? Anything you want to add?
No, I think we talked about some good stuff. I'll look for this posted. If anyone wants to hit me up with questions, I'm always good for a quick Facebook.
Okay, well, where can people find you?
I am. We are doing Clubhouse sessions for the Atlas Society. And so if you go onto Clubhouse, there's a schedule under the Atlas Society. We also host the Ayn Rand Fan Club on YouTube. It's a YouTube channel. We talk about lots of these issues. We talked about schisms. talked about confusion with you. Our last episode was on sanction. That's gotten a lot of good response.
We were talking about being confused with other political parties. Let's be clear what we mean by confusion.
Well, I think the confusion is about political parties, but it also has become a rationale for not working with other people that are close to you.
Sure. All right, Scott Schiff, thank you very much for being here. For now, this is Michael Liebowitz and the Rational Egoist signing off. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.